The photograph surfaced on a humid afternoon in Charleston, buried under a stack of brittle estate sale ephemera no one else had bothered to touch. Laura Mason, a curator at the Carolina Lowcountry Museum, noticed it only because the cardboard mount had warped into a shallow bow, as if resisting being handled. At first glance, it was unremarkable, another mid-19th century portrait of a woman seated stiffly before a painted backdrop, two infants resting on either side of her. The studio lighting was flat, the tonal range muted, the kind of image that survived only because someone had slipped it into a drawer and forgotten it. Yet something in the woman's posture held Laura's attention. It wasn't fear, exactly, but a kind of bracing, as if she had prepared herself for the exact moment the shutter would fall. Laura brought the photograph closer to the window. The woman's dress was plain muslin, its sleeves slightly too long, suggesting it had been borrowed or hastily altered. Her hair was parted severely, pinned back in a way that exposed the angular line of her jaw. The babies, newborns, judging from the curled fists and heavily swaddled blankets, lay with their eyes shut, their faces turned slightly inward toward her. Only after several seconds did Laura notice the wrists. The woman's hands, folded deliberately in her lap, bore two distinct bands of raised scar tissue circling each wrist, shackle scars, unmistakable to anyone who had studied the visual record of American slavery. The skin looked thickened, uneven, the scars old enough to have healed but recent enough to retain brutality. Laura inhaled slowly, feeling the temperature of the room shift. Back at the museum, she asked the imaging specialist for a high-resolution scan. Under digital magnification, new details surfaced, details the naked eye would never have caught in the glare of the estate sale shop. Along the infants' blankets, near the folds where the fabric gathered beneath their necks, irregular darkened patches had seeped deep into the fibers. The patterns were inconsistent with shadow or aging. Laura watched as the software enhanced the chromatic values. The stains darkened, rusted in tone, concentrated along the edges, exactly where a pool might have dried. Blood, the specialist murmured behind her, unprompted. It looks like dried blood. Laura felt a pressure build behind her ribs, a sensation she had experienced only a few times before, always in the presence of an artifact that demanded explanation yet refused to yield it easily. The museum's senior conservator, an expert on antebellum photography, examined the image next. His frown deepened the longer he looked. "This woman, she's not posing for a keepsake," he said quietly. "Someone made her sit for this. Someone wanted this image taken." "Why?" Laura asked. No one answered. The photograph had no studio mark, no embossed border, no handwritten date, nothing except the faint shadow of a thumbprint in the upper margin, pressed into the surface with surprising force. By evening, 3 historians had gathered around the enlarged projection in the research lab. They debated the composition, compared it to known examples from Charleston and Savannah studios, searched for clues in the lighting angle, the backdrop, the torn edge of the mount. But the details resisted categorization. The shackle scars. The blood-like stains. The woman's rigid, almost defiant expression, an expression devoid of resignation, yet marked by an exhaustion deeper than grief. Some photographs reveal themselves gradually, their secrets unraveling with patient attention. This one felt different. It felt like a warning. And by the next morning, when the investigative trail began in earnest, Laura would discover that the photograph was not merely an artifact. It was evidence. They started with the absence. No studio mark meant the photograph had likely been taken outside the formal circuits of Charleston's commercial photographers. No date, no name, no inscription, nothing the cataloging system could comfortably file. For a full day, the image sat in quarantine in Laura's office, an object without a label, an accusation without a witness. On the second morning, she carried a printout to the reading room of the South Carolina Historical Society, the air there cool and dry, smelling faintly of dust and linen. She'd called ahead to meet with someone who could help her move beyond instinct and into evidence. Dr. Mark Holloway arrived 10 minutes late, as always, his arms already full of folders. He was a Civil War historian whose work focused on coastal plantations in Georgia and South Carolina, on the human infrastructure beneath campaign maps and battle reports. Laura laid the printout on the table without preamble. He adjusted his glasses, leaned in, and exhaled through his teeth. "Those aren't work scars," he said, nodding at the woman's wrists. "Those are restraints. Iron cuffs worn for a long time." "And the infants?" Laura asked. He hesitated. "The staining is suggestive. But a photograph can't prove blood. What we need is context. Where was this found?" She slid the estate sale paperwork across the table. The address belonged to a Barlow family property on the outskirts of Charleston, a collapsing farmhouse that had been in probate for years. The files listed generations of owners, but one name repeated in the mid-19th century, Barlow Plantation, coastal Georgia, later consolidated into a Charleston-held estate. "Georgia," Mark murmured. "That might explain the backdrop. Traveling photographers sometimes moved along the coast before the war. But look!" He pointed at the faint line of a doorframe just visible behind the woman's shoulder. This wasn't a painted studio background. It was a real interior, a boarded window at her back, rough planks visible in the shadows. "Not a studio," he said. "Somebody carrying equipment into a house. That's unusual. Especially with an enslaved woman as the primary subject." Laura felt again that pressure in her chest. "So we find her," she said. "She has to exist somewhere on paper." They began with the Barlow papers, 3 heavy gray archival boxes that had sat undisturbed for years on an upper shelf. Inside were ledgers, plantation inventories, insurance policies, and bundles of correspondence tied with disintegrating ribbon. For hours, the only sounds were the rattle of paper, the occasional creak of a chair. Outside, Charleston's humidity pressed against the windows, but in the reading room the air remained as controlled and indifferent as ever. It was Mark who found her. "Here," he said quietly, sliding a ledger toward Laura, his finger marking a line dated May 1861. "Female, age approximately 20, name, Evelyn. Note in margin, house servant, recent purchase, twins due in late summer." The handwriting was neat, efficient. A few lines down, a notation in a different ink. "Evelyn, discipline required, attempted absconding twice, confined to quarters." Beside it, a small symbol Laura had seen in other plantation books, a shorthand for punishment by whipping. She swallowed. "Is there more?" They searched the subsequent months. In August 1861, under a list of weather losses and crop damage, another entry appeared, the ink smeared as if written in haste. "Storm of August 14th, heavy flooding in low fields. Evelyn, Negro woman, missing with 2 infants. Presumed runaway. Notified neighboring properties and patrol." The next line was darker, as if the pen had been pressed harder into the page. "Warning, woman is considered a danger. Previous escape attempts. Shows defiance when corrected. Marked for sale if recovered." "Dangerous," Mark repeated softly. "A woman who ran while pregnant. Then ran again with newborns. From their point of view, that's dangerous." Laura studied the neat script. "Dangerous. Defiant. Marked for sale." "And she vanished in a storm," she said. "With both children." They moved from ledgers to correspondence. In a folder labeled 1861 to 1862, Laura found a letter from a neighboring planter, written in a clipped, irritated hand. "Your girl Evelyn was sighted on the river road 2 nights past." It read. "Carried something in her arms, moving despite rain and wind. Riders lost her trail near the marsh. If she is recovered, I advise immediate sale, or more permanent measures. Such women sow trouble among the rest." More permanent measures. Laura's fingers tightened around the page. This was the language of people who treated human lives as inventory, whose solutions to disobedience moved along a spectrum from whipping to sale to disappearance. She looked back at the photograph. The woman in the image now had a provisional name. Evelyn. The shackle scars matched the notes about confinement. The exhaustion in her face aligned with someone who had endured punishment, pregnancy, flight, recapture, or worse. But the babies. The stains. Storm, August 14th. Mark said, pulling an old newspaper from a separate box. Savannah Daily Republican. Listen, violent tempest beats coast. Reports of flooding and loss of livestock. Several Negroes reported missing, believed to have absconded under cover of weather. No names, of course. Nothing about infants. Laura said. Infants weren't counted as anything but increase. Mark replied. They wouldn't warrant column space. By late afternoon, they had established a narrow window. The photograph had to have been taken between the twins' birth and the storm of August 14, 1861, or in the immediate aftermath, if the plantation had recovered them. If this was punishment, Laura said slowly, if they forced her to sit there as some kind of record, or… Mark interrupted gently. If someone else wanted a record. Not the owner. Someone who knew she was in danger. They both looked again at the absence of a studio mark, the rough interior, the way the woman's eyes were not quite aligned with the camera, as if focused on a human presence just beyond the frame. Whoever took this, Laura said, didn't intend it as a family keepsake. It feels forensic. Mark nodded. The question is, did Evelyn survive that storm? And if she did, why is the only trace we have of her a photograph with blood on her children's blankets? Outside, the light was beginning to fail. The staff announced closing time. Laura slipped the photograph back into its protective sleeve, feeling the thin cardboard flex under her hands. They had found a name and a disappearance. Between those 2 points stretched everything that mattered, the storm, the flight, the twins, the blood. And somewhere in the archives, hidden in ledgers, in reports written by men who barely considered her human, was the rest of Evelyn's story. The enhanced skin revealed the object only after several hours of adjustments, contrast lifted, shadows isolated, grain reduced 1 pixel at a time. It began as nothing more than a distortion in the lower corner of the photograph, a blur half hidden beneath the infant's blankets. But when the software sharpened the edge, the blur resolved into metal, a curved iron fragment no larger than a child's palm, jagged on one side as if violently broken. Laura leaned forward. That shape, look at the curvature. Mark studied the projection. It's too small for an adult's shackle. Too small for an ankle shackle, too curved for a lock plate. She said. But size for a child. His voice thinned. A child's restraint. The lab went silent. The hum of refrigeration units, the faint click of the imaging software, even the air conditioning vents seemed to recede. There was nothing in the image except the woman, the infants, and that mute piece of iron, its placement deliberate, almost staged. Someone put it there, Laura said. Not by accident. Mark ran a hand across his forehead. We know some plantations restrained infants. During transport, during punishment of parents, during other measures. But a broken piece? Why break it? Because someone wanted it to be seen. They printed a magnified crop of the fragment and pinned it onto the evidence board beside the earlier scans. Under magnification, rust patterns spread across the metal like dried veins. The broken edge showed not a clean cut but stress fractures. Metal snapped under force. Could Evelyn have broken it herself? Laura asked quietly. Not likely, Mark said. Child shackles were built thick. They weren't meant to free the wearer. They were meant to free the overseer from the burden of care. He began pacing, the photograph still projected behind him. If someone photographed her and placed that fragment beside the infant's, they intended to communicate something. A warning, a plea, a record. Or a defense. Laura murmured. If the twins were hurt, whoever took the photograph might have wanted to show she didn't do it. That suggestion hung between them like a shadow. Later, with the room dimmed and most staff gone, Laura returned to the table and turned the photograph over. Earlier, the back had seemed completely blank. But now, under a raking lamp angle, she saw faint impressions, pressure marks left by ink long faded. She adjusted the light again. Slowly, ghost-like handwriting surfaced. 3 lines. Slanted script. Letters wavering as if written in haste. If we don't return, let the world know the truth. A tremor passed through her fingertips. She called Mark back into the room. He read the words without speaking, jaw tightening as he examined the strokes. "That's not Evelyn's handwriting," he said. "You're certain?" "Positive. I've seen her name in multiple ledgers today. Her script is even controlled. Whoever wrote this, look at the pressure." They wrote quickly. Frightened. "So someone else took the photograph," Laura said. "Someone risking their life. And someone who believed they might not survive whatever came next. They photographed the inscription, then cross-referenced the paper stock against samples from Charleston, Savannah, Beaufort. The cardboard mount matched none of the major studios. Instead, the fiber composition suggested local manufacture, cheap, coarse, the sort used by itinerant photographers who traveled plantation to plantation before the war. "Someone with a portable camera," Mark said. "Someone with access to the house or quarters. Someone allowed near Evelyn after her disappearance." They examined plantation records again. In a side ledger, smaller, less formal, a listing of hired workers and temporary overseers for 1861, they found a brief entry beside a name unfamiliar to either of them. "Samuel Reed, laborer, hired July. SK * lead with carpentry. Has own equipment." Equipment. The word felt heavy. Photographers sometimes identified themselves as carpenters or mechanics, Mark said. It was safer. In the South, an outsider declaring himself a photographer risked suspicion, especially if he took interest in enslaved people. "And Reed disappears from the ledger after August," Laura noted. "No dismissal, no payment notation. Nothing." They looked at each other. "Storm," Mark said quietly. "August 14th. Evelyn vanished that night," Laura said. "And maybe Reed did too." Night settled outside the museum windows, the sky over Charleston turning the faint violet of early evening. The lab lights buzzed overhead. The photograph lay between them, its edges fragile, its surface now a map of scratches and meaning. "What if Reed was part of something?" Laura said. "An abolitionist network? A messenger? Someone trying to help her leave the plantation?" "It's possible," Mark said slowly. "But if he was helping her escape, why take the photograph? Why risk time to record this moment?" Laura looked again at the iron fragment, the stains, the weary defiance in Evelyn's face. "Because something had already gone wrong," she said. "And someone wanted proof." The photograph no longer felt like a portrait. It felt like testimony, an attempt to speak across time from people who feared they would not survive the next hour. And the message on the back, fragile as dried leaves, now pointed them toward a deeper, darker truth. Someone besides Evelyn had tried to save her. And someone else had failed to return. They found the river lanterns almost by accident, in a misfiled packet of correspondence that should never have been in Charleston at all. 3 days after discovering the inscription on the back of the photograph, Laura and Mark sat in the Georgia Historical Archives in Savannah, surrounded by boxes pulled from a section labeled Private Relief Associations, 1850 to 1875. The reading room was colder than Charleston's, the air humming with dehumidifiers and the low murmur of researchers buried in their own obsessions. A slender archivist named Henderson brought them a thin folder wrapped in brown paper. "This one doesn't belong here," he said. "Came in with a donation of Confederate veterans' letters, but it's not that. Mentions your Barlow plantation, though. Thought you'd want to see it." Inside were 6 letters and a single undated report, all written in the same tight, careful hand. The heading on the report stopped Laura: River Lantern Committee, Southern Route, Coastal Section. She read aloud. "On the matter of the woman Evelyn and her infants, assistance rendered at Barlow property per arrangement with SR contact established through trusted intermediary." Mark leaned over her shoulder. "SR. Could be Samuel Reed." The report continued in calm, understated language that felt obscene in its restraint. "On the night of the great storm, woman departed with 2 newborns under escort. Departure was delayed by damage to outbuildings and increased patrols. Party moved east by river path at approximately 3rd watch. Objective: reach Cedar Crossing, then Marsh Trail to Lantern House 4. Lantern House 4, Mark repeated. Safe house. Laura's pulse quickened. Keep going. She turned the page. Rain intensified. River flooded banks. Infants in poor condition, weak, underfed, mothers showing signs of recent punishment. Escort reports difficulty maintaining speed. By first light, party should have reached Lantern House 4. No confirmation received. There it was, a rescue attempt. At the bottom of the report, a final line had been added in darker ink. Note: 3 days later, Lantern House 4 reports no arrival of woman with twins. Status of party unknown. Further retrieval impossible due to heightened patrol activity. Laura stared at the sentence until the letters seemed to blur. They never made it, she said softly. They left the plantation, but they never arrived. Henderson cleared his throat gently. River lanterns were rumored, not documented, he said. Small abolitionist cells along the rivers. They used lanterns as signals. Most of what we know is oral history. This, he tapped the report, is the first written mention I've seen with that name on it. Do you recognize the author? Mark asked. Henderson pulled a notebook from his pocket, flipped to a page, and pointed. Matthew Carter. White Methodist from a small town upriver. He ran a store that went out of business in 1860. Family letters suggest he was more involved in Northern sympathies than he admitted. He disappears from local records during the war, then reappears afterward in Philadelphia. Philadelphia. The city Evelyn would later reach under another name. Laura felt the strands tightening. Does he mention her anywhere else? They combed through the remaining letters. Most were logistical, mentions of cargo, weather, friends in the north. But one, dated September 1861, stood apart. It bore no salutation, only a single, heartbreaking paragraph. To those who received this, the woman we were meant to guard did not arrive. I fear the worst. I write in the hope that, if she appears at some future station, you will know that we tried. She was called Evelyn. She carried 2 infants. If she comes to you alone, do not ask her where the children are unless she offers. She has already walked through enough darkness. Silence settled over the table. Laura read the lines again, her throat tightening around the words. He anticipated it, she said. He imagined her arriving, without them. Which means at least one person believed she could survive, Mark said. Even if the children didn't. He moved back to the photograph, now reproduced in front of them on matte paper. The inscription on the back, if we don't return, let the world know the truth. That's not Evelyn preparing to speak about herself. That sounds like someone trying to protect her from blame. From blame for what happened to the twins, Laura finished. Henderson spoke quietly. The oral histories I've heard, they're full of women who ran with children and lost them in the swamps, in the rivers, in the dark. Those women rarely got to tell their own stories. People called them cursed, reckless. They blamed them for choosing flight at all. Laura thought of the shackle scars, the broken child's restraint, the stains that looked like dried blood. The river lanterns, she said, weren't just rescuers. They were witnesses. They wrote reports. Took notes. Maybe even photographs. Which means, Mark added, that somewhere in those papers, or somewhere they sent them, there might be another trace of Evelyn. And of whoever took that picture. The report on the table had already overturned their assumption of a successful escape. The woman with twins did not reach Lantern House 4. The river lantern's own records admitted it. Between Barlow Plantation and Cedar Crossing lay 25 miles of swamp and forest, crossed in the dark during a storm. Somewhere along that route, something irreparable happened. And someone, in the aftermath, had lifted a camera. They found Evelyn again, not in Georgia, but in a ledger written in a different hand, under a different flag. Weeks into the search, when the plantation ledgers and abolitionist correspondence began looping back on themselves, Mark suggested they try a different archive, the National Archives branch holding Union Army operational records for the coastal campaigns. Runaways show up as numbers most of the time. He'd warned as they submitted their request. But sometimes a clerk got talkative. The research room in Maryland felt more bureaucratic than scholarly. Fluorescent light, metal carts, gray archival boxes labeled with regiment numbers instead of surnames. A staff historian rolled out a cart stacked with bound volumes. Provost Marshal Logs, Department of the South, 1862. Laura ran her finger down columns of cramped script. Contraband, age approximate 30, female, no dependents. Boy 12, found alone on road. Lines of people reduced to lines of ink. Halfway through the second volume, Mark's hand tightened on a page. Here, he said. March 3, 1862. Read that. The entry was brief but denser than the others. Female, self-given name Evelyn Harris, approximate 21 years, arrived in camp alone. Claims origin, Georgia coast. Speech indicates plantation upbringing. States she has no children now. When questioned about injuries, refused to elaborate, stated only that she left them behind to save them. Beside it, in the margin, a different pen had added, woman appears deeply traumatized. Repeatedly touches small iron bracelet carried in pocket, child-sized, with dried blood on inner surface. Laura felt her throat constrict. The words, no children now, seemed to reverberate off the page. Harris, she murmured. New name. Common practice, Mark said. People chose new surnames when they reached Union lines. Names of officers, places, sometimes just words that sounded like freedom. He turned to the following pages. The clerk had added a few more notes over the next days. E. Harris assigned to hospital laundry. Works with diligence, very quiet. Startles at loud noises. Wakes screaming in night, though denies bad dreams when questioned. And then, a week later, observed Harris again with iron bracelet. Appears unwilling to part with object despite offers of clothing, food. When advised to throw it away as reminder of suffering, replied, it is the only proof I did not abandon them. Laura sat back dizzy. So she did reach Union lines, she said. Alive. Without the twins. And still carrying iron from some kind of restraint. Mark added. Child-sized. Blood-stained. He traced the date at the top of the page. This is less than a year after the storm. She could have moved through networks, river lanterns, Union scouts, freed people already on the move. But the bracelet, Laura said. Why call it proof? Proof of what? That whatever happened to those children, Mark said quietly, didn't happen because she stopped loving them. Silence settled between them. The rustle of other researchers' pages, the muffled squeak of a cart wheel, all of it faded. Laura imagined a woman stepping into a rough Union encampment after days or weeks of hiding, wet, exhausted, wrist scarred, carrying a single piece of iron small enough for a child's limb. She imagined the questions, the suspicion that always followed a mother without her children. What did you do? Why are you alone? The bracelet in her pocket, slick once with blood, had become something else, not just an instrument of control, but a talisman against accusation. A witness she could hold in her hand. Mark kept reading. There were no further personal notes. The last mention of Evelyn Harris appeared 2 months later. E. Harris transferred to Refugee Camp No. 2 per order. Recommended for placement with Women's Aid Society in North. Literate. Signs name with confident hand. Literate. Laura thought of the inscription on the back of the photograph. The slope of the letters. The panic in the strokes. Different handwriting, she said. Different moment. She didn't write the message on that photograph. Mark agreed. But by the time she reached this camp, she could sign her own name. Someone taught her, or she already knew and had hidden it. Henderson's earlier warning echoed in Laura's mind. These networks weren't just rescuing bodies. They were creating witnesses. Laura closed the volume carefully. We have her escape attempt from the plantation, she said. We have the river lantern's failed rendezvous. Now we have her emerging on the other side of that darkness under a new name, alone, and clinging to a child's iron bracelet. And still, Mark said, we don't know what she meant when she told the officers she left them behind to save them. He glanced toward the cart of unexamined volumes. If she went north, he said, someone there kept records. Women's aid societies loved paperwork, applications, case notes, reports. Somewhere there may be a file on Evelyn Harris. And if there is, Laura replied, she might have tried, in her own words, to explain what happened on that first night after she ran. They requested the next set of boxes, this time from the archives of Northern aid organizations. Outside, the sky over Maryland was clear and indifferent. Inside, on a single line in a faded ledger, a woman who had vanished in a Georgia storm spoke once more, through the brief, rigid script of a union clerk, no children now. Left them behind to save them. Holding iron that remembered their blood. They found her again in Philadelphia, though not at first in the place they expected. Women's Aid Society records from the 1860s and 1870s were notoriously incomplete, scattered across church basements, private collections, and unindexed city archives. For 2 days, Laura and Mark sifted through brittle files in a Methodist Charities reading room, breathing in dust that tasted faintly of candle soot and old starch. Most documents were routine, lists of blankets distributed, bread deliveries, admissions logs. Then, in a bound ledger from 1864, a name appeared in looping, confident script, Evelyn Harris, admitted March 12. Condition stable. SK*LLS, laundry, seam, reading, writing. Recommended, domestic training. Reading. Writing. Evelyn had been writing her own name for at least 2 years by then. And the strokes were practiced, not the shaky, urgent handwriting on the back of the photograph. Another confirmation she had not been the author of that message. The following pages detailed her participation in the Society's literacy classes and her quiet integration into the small community of refugee women, formerly enslaved, widowed, displaced, who filled the narrow brick houses of North Philadelphia. But it was a newspaper article, found not in an archive but clipped into a scrapbook kept by a volunteer, that shifted the tone of the search. The Philadelphia Daily Chronicle, 1878. Founding of the Haven Home for Refugee Women, Mrs. Evelyn Harris among the charter members. A grainy portrait accompanied the article. Evelyn stood among 4 other women, their expressions sober, their dresses plain but meticulously kept. Unlike the others, she faced the camera with an air of contained resistance. In her right hand, held low against her skirts, was a small object, a dark, curved piece of iron. Laura inhaled sharply. "That's it," she said. "The same fragment. The broken child's shackle." "No doubt," Mark agreed. "She kept it her entire life." The Haven Home's early mission reports described Evelyn as a steady presence, unflinching in crisis, particularly devoted to assisting women fleeing violent circumstances. She often took the night watch, walking the dim hallways with a lantern, calming new arrivals who woke screaming from memories they refused to describe. In the 1881 report, a notation appeared beside her name. Declined photograph for anniversary pamphlet. In 1883. Refuses all portrait sittings. In 1885. Will participate only if permitted to hold personal object. The last allowed portrait, the one in the newspaper, was indeed the final one. Every later request was declined with the same explanation. "I do not wish my face to live longer than I do." Laura read that line twice. She feared something, she said quietly. Public exposure. Recognition. Or memory itself. Mark nodded. Many women who escaped the Deep South feared being found even decades later. But for Evelyn, maybe it was also that the past followed her in ways she couldn't fully sever. In the archives of the Haven Home, they found a file labeled simply Harris, E. It was thin, but one page stood out, a handwritten statement Evelyn had offered as part of an application to teach literacy classes. The script was steady, unembellished. "I was born enslaved. I do not know my parents' names. I came north during the war. I have known hunger and freedom, and I choose freedom. I will help any woman who wishes the same." Nothing about Georgia. Nothing about the River Road. Nothing about the twins. Her past was a sealed room she would not open. At the bottom of the page, she had drawn a single, small symbol, 2 curved lines, almost touching, like a bracelet broken apart. Her signature, Laura murmured. A reminder. A confession, Mark added. But only to herself. They consulted city directories, wills, death notices. Evelyn Harris died in 1894, aged about 54, her cause of death listed as exhaustion following long illness. She had no children, no surviving family, no known correspondence from the South. Her estate consisted of a few clothes, a small trunk of letters she never mailed, and the iron fragment she kept beside her bed. The inventory list described it clinically. Item: iron bracelet, child-sized, broken. Condition: poor. But no one reading the list understood the weight it carried, or what that piece of iron had witnessed. Laura closed the final folder and looked at the portrait again. Evelyn's eyes were steady, her posture severe. She faced the camera not as a woman hiding but as a woman refusing to surrender the story she alone remembered fully. Yet she had never spoken, not to the aid societies, not to the Haven home, not even in private notes, of the twins who had once lain beside her in blood-stained blankets. Whatever happened that night, Laura said softly, she carried it for the rest of her life. And she tried, Mark added, in her own way, to protect other women from the kinds of losses she survived. The archives closed around them with the hush of old paper settling. They had traced Evelyn's steps northward, through violence, disappearance, reinvention. But the darkest question remained unanswered. Somewhere between the storm and the Union lines, 2 infants vanished. And Evelyn's silence had stretched across the decades like a locked door waiting for someone brave enough to enter. The cellar surfaced by accident. The Barlow farmhouse, where the photograph had first been found, had stood abandoned for decades, its roof sagging inward, its floorboards softened by rot. When the Historical Society finally secured funds for stabilization, a restoration team began peeling back the layers of collapse. Most of what they uncovered was expected: rusted farming tools, broken crates, a scattering of mouse-eaten papers. But on the 3rd day, a carpenter probing the floor struck something harder than soil, something that gave a hollow, unnatural sound. Beneath 2 layers of warped planks, he found a seam, a square outline, hand-cut, its edges sealed with a mixture of resin and mud that had hardened like stone. A trapdoor. Laura and Mark arrived 2 hours later, summoned by a breathless call from the site's supervisor. By the time they reached the farmhouse, the crew had cleared the debris around the hatch but not yet opened it. Dust hung suspended in beams of afternoon light, the air thick with the scent of damp wood. "No one's touched it," the supervisor said. "We figured you'd want to see it first." The hinges were so corroded they crumbled under the first twist of a wrench. As the board lifted, cold air rushed out, air that smelled faintly of clay and something older, earthier, like time itself settling. A narrow stair led down into darkness. The cellar was small, scarcely larger than a storage closet. The walls were brick, mortared hastily, the ceiling low enough that even Laura had to stoop slightly. A coating of dust softened every surface, undisturbed for more than a century. But the room was not empty. In the far corner lay 2 wooden bundles, each about the length of a swaddled infant. The wood was unfinished, nailed together crudely but with care, hands shaking, perhaps, but determined. The bundles rested side by side, as if someone had placed them gently, and then sealed the room forever. Beside them lay 2 tiny iron bracelets. Child-sized. Broken. Laura felt the world contract to a single point of stillness. Mark knelt but did not touch the objects. "They're identical to the fragment in the photograph," he whispered. "Same curvature. Same thickness. And there's 2, Laura said. Her voice trembled. "One for each child." A lantern beam caught something else, a sheet of heavy paper, curled at the edges but intact, lying against the far wall. Laura approached carefully, heart pounding. It was a photograph. A duplicate of the original. Same composition. Same rigid posture. Same stains on the blankets. But this copy had been kept safe from light and moisture. Its details were sharper, the shadows clearer. And on its back, still legible, the same desperate inscription: "If we don't return, let the world know the truth." Now the seller's purpose became unmistakable. Someone, likely the photographer, perhaps Samuel Reed or another member of the River Lanterns, had carried the infants into this room during or after the storm. Someone had placed them gently in makeshift wooden cradles. Someone had broken the iron restraints from their limbs. Someone had sealed the cellar to protect what remained. "They didn't survive the first night," Mark said quietly. "The stains on the blankets, they weren't from after the photograph. They were already bleeding when it was taken." "And he knew," Laura said. "Whoever took that picture, he knew they wouldn't make it. That's why he wrote the message. He wanted to tell the world so she wouldn't be blamed." They both imagined the scene, the storm raging outside, Evelyn fleeing in terror, the infants fragile, weakened by punishment, hunger, or injury. A rescuer, alone, carrying them through rising water, realizing they were dying, or already gone. Choosing to document their condition, to show through an image that the mother had not harmed them. And then, knowing he would not reach the safe house, he hid them in this cellar, out of reach of patrols, out of sight of those who would desecrate them, before the storm swallowed him too. The bundles had no inscriptions, no dates, no names. Yet the truth radiated from the room like a held breath finally released. "They were never meant to vanish," Laura said. "Someone tried to preserve their existence. Someone tried to give their mother a defense she would never read." Mark's eyes moved to the sealed doorway. "And Evelyn never knew. She walked north with only the bracelet and her memories." They climbed out slowly, each step heavy with the weight of what they had uncovered. Outside, sunlight swept across the overgrown fields where the Barlow plantation had once stretched, indifferent as ever. The site supervisor asked, "What is it? What did you find?" Laura looked back toward the open hatch, the darkness within no longer silent. "A part of the story," she said. "A part that was buried so she wouldn't carry all the blame." She did not add the rest. "A part that explains the silence in Evelyn's eyes and every photograph she refused to take."